opinions and the opinions of all experts regarding economy growth in Egypt. Thus, in this document, we try as much as we can to clarify how do we see the coming phase, what is our vision as a state in the coming phase, and how can we enhance the role of the private sector to lead all economic activities in Egypt. In fact, I would like to emphasize that we started this, some of you might remember that this document was a reaction, but in fact we started developing this document last November. So it's almost 6 months since we started discussing this document for the first time, and we were looking at the economic activities, and we found that there is a clear need for a vision for the coming 5 years at least. What are the activities the state must be present in, and what are the activities the state should exit, so that we give a bigger opportunity to the private sector. And when we started developing this document, we formed it in a different manner. I did not depend on my colleagues, the ministers or members in the government. We formed working groups comprised of ministers exactly like all other entities. So we had with us experts, specialists, representatives of the private sector while developing this document. And over the past 7 months, we had more than one draft and more than one version of the document, and we discussed it in closed sessions. And for the first time, I'm saying that I used to sit on my own with my colleagues and not the other ministers, so that we would not find any pressure to move in a particular dimension, because we wanted this document to be an independent one. That's why I wanted to listen to the opinions of experts who are not present in the government. Why do we issue this document? Why do we need it? The whole world is right now, and of course you are seeing that the whole world is witnessing that this is a turning point in the history of humanity, and a new world map is formed in different fields: political, economic, military, social, and we do not know when would be the end of the current crisis, and of course afterwards the world would look different. So this made us start last November as we tried to develop such a draft, and we started to see what's happening all over the world, and we found that there are countries issued a similar document. And here you can see 3 countries that started and issued these documents 2 years ago. It's China issued it in 2020, Indonesia 2020, and India issued it in 2021. And we found that what made these countries work on these documents were the crises starting with the pandemic COVID-19 and the changes. So the countries started to see what would be the role of the governments in this economy. And that's why we found that the main engine that made the countries implement and hold such a document was the idea of organizing markets as well as enhancing competitiveness, as this is one of the priorities of especially emerging economies. On the right-hand side, you can see what are the motives of the countries to develop such documents, and we found that the most important motive was regulating markets, enhancing competitiveness, trade liberalization. In Egypt, we found, and we need to talk about the Egyptian nature. Egypt, starting 2011 with all the political changes and 2 revolutions, as well as going through a very difficult period and then a big economic reform program. The state did not find an alternative except developing economy through increasing the public investments in the Egyptian economy, to pump money in a lot of projects with the aim of reconstructing the state and in the meantime creating as much opportunities as we can at a time when it was difficult for the private sector to shoulder this responsibility. Because, of course, the private sector, in light of unstable political conditions and unstable economic ones, if we talk to it about creating 1 million job opportunities every year, and expansion was illogical. So the state, like all other countries that have been through similar experiences, found that they had to increase public investments and expenditures. Since day one, we, the government, when we were talking about this, we were fully confident that even if this would be a long period, yet it would be an exception. The state and its institutions can't keep leading the economic activities. But also, we need to know where did the public investments go. It went to infrastructure, education, health and transport. Fields that needed a large volume of investments, and I think that the private sector would have never been able to do this in a short time, to pave the way for having an infrastructure that would enable the private sector to start its work. By time we stopped to see that now we have the portfolio of the state-owned assets and it is spread in all sectors. And on this chart, you can see the comparison between Egypt and other countries regarding the value of the state-owned assets to the GDP. 50% of the Egyptian GDP are state-owned assets. In comparison to other countries, when we look at averages in Latin America, we find 12%. In the EU, it does not be more than 30%, and this means that the state in Egypt exists in the economic activities at a higher percentage than it should be. So our motive to develop this document was that our vision for that is that we are going through a new phase, and the state need now to see how can it reduce its presence, and it should be the private sector that would lead the path. So according to the directives of the president during the iftar of the Egyptian family in Ramadan, and when we held an international press conference as a government, we said that we target that the contribution of the private sector in public investments would increase from 30% to be 65% over the coming 3 years, to target that the economic growth in Egypt would be 7% or more. Despite all the challenges and the difficulties that the whole world is facing, but Egypt, with the challenges and with the overpopulation, we have no other alternative but to move in this direction. As for the main ideas in this document that we present to you today, and we ask you to start studying and giving your feedback on, to develop this document, we read the 30 international experiences of 30 countries that developed such a document. We went through these documents and we saw how they drafted, and we did the comparison studies to see what is the difference between Egypt and these other countries. According to this comparison, we find the similarities and differences between us and these other countries so as to be close to these other countries. But in the meantime, we discussed matters with the chambers of commerce, chambers of industry, as well as the exports councils. 20 experts contributed to this document, and when these experts worked together, they sat with other experts and specialists to listen to their opinions. We got 25 different editions and publications, and these 25 would be available to you, so that if you want to have reference to any information in this document, you will find 25 documents and books we developed, and these 25 are specialized in all the sectors we're covering. Besides that, we went through all the international reports published by international organizations and the firms and the consulting offices that are here before you, like the World Bank, the UNODC. And we went through their documents to see how can we benefit from that in developing the Egyptian document. So, this document that we are launching today in your presence to start the experts dialogue has 8 topics, and we summarized it in 8 pages only. And we used the template of the OECD, and we looked at the other documents of other countries, so we did not want to put in this document a lot of details and a lot of information. We tried to make it straight to the point. So it is just a document of 20 papers, and some details and figures are in an annex. But the document is also in 20 pages, covering 8 topics. These are the ones before you: the main objectives, the methodology of identifying the state-owned assets, the mechanism of implementing the state ownership for these assets, the role of Egypt's sovereign fund, and the idea of partnership with the private sector, enhancing partnership between the public and private sectors, the rules for the presence of the state, as well as the legislative framework and the competitive fairness. Because people talked about inequality in opportunities between the state and the private sector, so we wanted to see how can we achieve fair competitiveness and create the suitable legislative framework. And finally, what is the executive framework for implementing this document? Because if we do not put a clear framework with a time schedule, then this won't be a valuable document. We need to interpret it into monitoring, follow-up program, as well as in implementation program. The beginning you will find in the document, and this is an important point I wanted to emphasize. Maybe I said that in the international press conference. The state increased its presence in the economic activities at a certain moment for a specific reason. If we look at the period between 2011 up till 2015, in these 4 years, the state has been through a lot of difficulties that reduced the economic growth rate, increasing unemployment by 13 or 14%. Egypt's ranking was reduced, and also the foreign reserve was decreased. We had very low figures that reached at certain moments only 20. So the state at the time did not have any other alternative but to intervene to support the Egyptian economy And once more emphasizing that it was illogical to ask the private sector during that phase to push the economic development and to invest in the infrastructure and to work in different sectors where there was no conducive environment for the private sector to play its role. That's why the state, to rectify the economic path, was pumping public investments as well as implementing national projects targeting infrastructure, as well as creating a large volume of job opportunities. And today, with all the difficult conditions the world is going through, the unemployment rate in Egypt is 7.4%, and it was 13.5% in 2013 and 2014. With the increase of population, 2 million are added to our population every year. So the objective of these projects was not only to implement very important projects for the state in different fields, agriculture, industry, infrastructure, urbanization, network of roads, ports and airports, but it was creating a lot of job opportunities. And we knew very well that the environment was not suitable for the private sector to create all these job opportunities. And along with that, we launched the program of economic reform. We started it by the end of 2016, and we are continuing it through the structural reforms. What is the methodology of identifying the state-owned assets? And the document mentioned this because I follow up the opinions of experts. Experts say, how did you identify the sectors that the state would be present in or absent from? We had two teams working in parallel, one from the Ministry of Economic Development of Planning, since it's the ministry that's working on economy, and the group formed from experts in the Information and Decision Support Center that had government experts and also economic experts. The two groups came up with the same standards. They said that the standards for selecting the economic activities for the state to exit or to be in are these four standards. And according to that, they have given a weight to every point. So when I come to say that the state is going to exit this economy, then it would be decided according to the score and weights. Part of this was the relation between the commodity and the service and the national economy. And here we're talking about a lot of elements to be discussed. The other standard was that the activity itself might not be attractive to the private sector due to its nature. The nature of the activity is that it is not that lucrative. So it is not expected that the private sector would be part of it. The third standard is that the state should exit the consumption industries, because we are there in some of these industries and we see that the state should exit them. The next standard is that the government and the state can be the supporter and the regulatory body of the fourth generation technology, and not a lot of people are specialized in this field. So we as a state might be involved in that to build the infrastructure for the fourth generation technology with the new activities. Of course, the private sector then can start to play its role. The presence of the state does not negatively influence the investments of the private sector. And the last point is that we see that the state and the existing investments in some of these sectors are not well managed by the state. So it's better that we give it to the private sector because it can manage it better and operate it. That's why we identified how we will move in these sectors. For certain sectors, we will exit them totally over 3 years. And for other sectors, either we will be present as a state and we might reduce gradually our investments in them. But we believe for over 3 years the state should be there in these sectors, and there are other sectors that we need to continue in, and we might increase the government investments even in it, since the public sector is the one working on it and the private sector is not interested in it. So before you, without getting into details, because you will find all these details in the document, and we wish that you would share with us your opinions about this document so that we can amend it and listen to your opinion. We have put clearly the sectors that we need to exit in 3 years, and the sectors in which the state would be there but reduce its presence, and there are other sectors will increase our presence in. And we have identified in details, as you can see, on activities like real estate, transport, ITC, insurance. What would be our vision as a state in dealing with these sectors? And here, for industries in particular, because this is an important role, we believe that industry in the first place is for the private sector. So we focused on industry, identifying what are the things that the state should be there in, because these are strategic industries, while the rest should be left to the private sector. Yet regarding exiting these activities, because when we talked about it, some people understood that we are going to sell the state-owned assets and we will do privatization. But what we found around the world was that there are a number of mechanisms called the exiting mechanisms from the economic activity, be it fully or partially. These are 7 mechanisms. Either we sell totally or partially through introducing strategic investors, or offer a part of these assets for the capital market to expand the ownership foundation for the Egyptian investors. And sometimes the exit is that the state can keep its assets, but it would give the management and the full operation to the private sector. Or when there is an increase in capital, this happens in partnership with the private sector. So it won't be only management and operation, but the private sector can provide funding if I want to increase the capital. So the whole idea is to give the operation and the management to the private sector totally. As for restructuring, a number of experts were there in government posts in the state and the government, and they know that the presence of the state in a number of companies that were established over decades. Some of these entities replicate their work. So if I want to do real restructuring, there might be merge between some of these companies and entities, and after we do this merge, we might offer or sell some of them to benefit from the real value. And for restructuring, I will give you an example. The companies that apply the public works sector or affiliate to other ministries, because there are a lot of companies affiliate to a lot of ministries. For them all, we will find that the presence of the state is big, and the Ministry of Public Works was one of the ministries that started the merger between companies, and we find that our assets as a state were not fully identified. We did not know all the state assets and their presence in all the companies, and this is what we worked on silently to confine the state assets. And the challenge now is the correct valuation of these assets. I'll say an expression that the economists know. A large number of these assets are valued in records only, because the state at certain phases did not have the trend to offer these assets in the markets or to have partnership with the private sector. So there was no realistic valuation of these assets. Today we are trying to restructure, do merger, and re-evaluate the assets. And this is a great effort that the state is working on to identify the real value of our assets, because the experience of establishing sovereign funds and putting the state-owned assets in them taught us that. This is another part of the big responsibility the state is shouldering and must work on. It is the real valuation of its assets, to know them well, so that when we offer them for partnership with the private sector or listed in the Egyptian capital market, we know its real value. So there are three main dimensions that would be taken into consideration. The first is that the exit would happen gradually. We made a proposal, and this was a debate with experts. Some of them said we wanted to do this aggressively over 3 years. Some experts said no, it might take longer. So this is part of your experience to tell us what are the experts from which we can exit fast, and what are the other sectors that need longer time. The second part is taking into consideration the security and strategic aspects of some economic activities. For some activities, the state should be present, even partial. The third part is that even if we'll talk about exiting certain activities and you know its implications, and if we are going to sell or dissolve something, we need to take into consideration the workers, the employees, the revenues. How to deal with all these things, they are all givens, should be taken into consideration when we develop our future plan. The governing rules for the presence of the state in this document is that we looked at the standards and principles made by OECD that has put the template for this document for all countries, and we used it. For also impartial competitiveness, this is a part of this document, because we want regulations without any discrimination or any concessions. So our idea is to develop the strategy of protecting competitiveness, evaluating all procedures, as well as enhancing the efficiency of competitiveness protection authority, to give a bigger role to it. For the executive framework, through this document, when you review it and give us your feedback, we will translate it into a clear executive framework with a time schedule, and accordingly we will all evaluate to what extent the state succeeded in implementing this document. So we will have a clear program. The president, during the iftar of the Egyptian family, he said, I want the government to put a program for the coming 4 years to provide $4 billion of the state-owned assets to be liquidated. So through this document and the sectors suggested in it, you will enable us to put the detailed time schedule. What are the sectors? How can we start evaluating these assets to start working on them? In fact, the dialogue we are launching today in your presence is just the beginning, and we were very keen to select you as the prominent experts of Egypt. Of course, there are other experts, and we will be keen to meet them in all the other discussions. But today, we are launching this document in the presence of representatives of the Parliament, the academia, the private sector, the Federation of Chambers of Commerce, to represent the groups we are targeting to listen to their opinions. How we will learn from the feedback of the experts? This would be through launching a dialogue platform, and we launch it today. There would be specialized workshops for the experts, and we will have also an application on the mobile phone, because we want to expand as much as we can the participation and the contribution of the experts and even the citizens who might be interested in these fields. This is the platform we launch. This is the website. In this platform, you will find all the publications and the documents related to this document. Of course, you will find this document to read, in addition to all the references and the other documents we published. And through this platform, we will hold electronic workshops besides the actual physical workshops. There would be other electronic workshops, and through it we listen to the opinions of the experts and specialists. And this is an example how the discussion rooms would be held, and you will find on this platform all the documents related to this document, the state ownership. Of course, we will hold a lot of workshops over the coming 2 months that would be attended by all experts in this field, and of course we will announce the places of these workshops and their dates. Some of them would be specialized workshops for the specific sectors we're talking about, so that all the experts working in these fields would attend these meetings and tell us how can we move in this direction. As we said, we are going to launch an application on the mobile phones, and there would be this platform on Android and Apple, so that people can log in and participate with us. Our objective from holding this meeting today is to ask you to help us. I consider this document, although we worked on it for 7 months, to be just a draft. And in this dialogue, we want to reach an agreement about the activities that we would exit along with the suitable time schedule. The other point, what are the needs of the private sector to enhance its presence in such sectors, as well as the steps and the positive messages you believe the state and the government should send in the future to reassure the private sector and to accelerate its movement. These are the things I wish through your experience we would learn about, and through the discussions and your opinions about the document, we wish you would be able to help us with these 3 main points, because this is what we want to receive your feedback on. We wish that in 3 months we would finalize the document to publish it officially, and it would be an economic constitution for the state in the near future. This document is part of the government reforms adopted by the state. We are in the second phase of economic reform that focuses on structural reforms, like the liquidation of the assets for $10 billion annually, as well as launching a package of investment incentives, developing the system of licensing for industrial projects, and a decision was issued recently according to the request of the private sector, in addition to increase competitiveness. I thank you, and sorry for being lengthy, but I found that it's a great opportunity along with my colleagues in the government, to listen to you as experts, and of course you will enrich our discussion. We as a state are open to all ideas, and through launching this document we are keen on listening to all different opinions, because our objective is that all this document with all the next steps would launch a new phase of economic growth in Egypt. How can we enhance once more the role of the private sector so that it can get back to lead the economic activities in the near future? God willing. Once more, thank you, and it would be an opportunity to meet you again and to listen to your interventions if you have any. In the name of Allah, thank you, Mr. Prime Minister, for the kind invitation. I'm Medhat Nafa. I was the head of the holding company for mineral industries. I read this document several times, and I would like to commend the great efforts exerted in it. And for the first time, I read the philosophy of the state regarding its ownership. How does the state think? What is its logic? Of course, we need to review some standards, but the beginning is excellent. And the state did not think this logic except before the January Revolution, the idea of public ownership. And it was focusing on the exiting mechanism only and did not talk about the philosophy. And why do we stay and where would we stay? The point I would like to raise is the exiting mechanism is the most important thing. We're talking about a lot of state-owned assets. So this mechanism should secure liquidity in the market, as well as fair pricing. And this would be achieved by having an active capital market. And the Egyptian capital market has now a capital that is only 8% of the GDP. So the exiting mechanism needs to have the infrastructure needed for it. And then 3 years would be enough. There would then be no problem with 3 years. A large percentage of agriculture and transformational industries are going to be exited by the government. But the state would be in certain fields, like, for example, insurance services and brokerage. We need to understand the philosophy, and profitability should not be one of the standards for the presence of the state. It could be a standard for exiting or remaining in a company or an activity, and not a sector. The state does not exit or stay in a certain sector for profitability. And it should be the private sector that should do such activities, and the state would play the role of the regulator and would be covering only the things that the private sector is not interested in. Also, the follow-up and implementation mechanism should go on as suggested in the document. I think that the issue of impartial competitiveness is so difficult. We cannot neglect the state even if it stays at a smaller level, because it is the legislator, the regulator, the executor. And here, regarding competitiveness, there are a lot of schools. I think we need to keep pace with them. We are not now talking about structure, and we are not saying that we are going to do pre-review for competitiveness, and thus we refuse the acquisition or the merger. And this might be against the consumers' rights. So we need to get back to the idea of the market conduct and not the market structure to understand competitiveness. Sorry for being lengthy, but I wanted to seize this opportunity. Thank you. Thank you very much. I thank you for the kind invitation for organizing this important meeting. And I would like to thank you for the effort in developing this document. It is clear that we are not here to discuss a short-term policy, but a long-term policy. So this is an important moment in which we are putting an important policy. And this is not available for every generation to contribute to developing these documents. So the idea of dialogue regarding this document, since it was just a draft, and giving an opportunity for discussion is very important and deserves due respect. The other point that I think that there would be a long dialogue about all sectors and industries in details, but the second part of the document identifies the sectors in which the state would be present and how we would govern its presence and how can we achieve impartial competitiveness. And this takes a large part of the document, and this is so important because it turns it into a policy and not just a work plan. I'm confident that over the coming few months we will find a lot of dialogues and important additions. I personally have some suggestions to make, one of which is that I'm still confused about what you mean by the state, especially that the state owns through different channels. The public sector, the public works sector. One important example is the public banks that are owned by the state, and some companies are owned directly by ministries. So I do not understand, do you mean by the state everything in public ownership or everything? Again, I'm so enthusiastic about this document, but I cannot think that we can put a commitment of 3 years for exiting certain sectors. And I think that this would be drafted in a way that gives more flexibility to adapt with the coming circumstances that we do not know yet. The third point is this document should be a vivid one. So how are we going to follow it as a community? How after a year we can change some things and percentages? So what is this community follow-up mechanism? Finally, I would like to emphasize that I praise the efforts and the decision to issue this document, but I would like also to say that it reflects our important discussions. And it expresses something bigger than our cooperation on the short term, and I believe it would be a turning point during the coming 10 or 20 years. Thank you. I would like to thank the whole team that worked on this document. This is something to make us optimistic, and it reassures us all. I would like to thank Dr. Ziad for asking you to clarify what you mean by the state. What is the definition of the state here? I have 2 points. We need to start identifying which companies in names to start implementing this, and according to our information, there are investments in power plants that already exist. So we want to know what are the investments that are part of this document. Would these companies be part of the participation of the private sector? This is an important point. The last point that needs further clarification is the position of the sovereign fund. Would it help with the participation and the partnerships, or will the partnership be opened as full ownership for some companies? Because these are the questions that the whole community is asking since the announcement was made about this document. And would the state offer part of it for public subscription in the capital market, or would it be private ownership fully? So we want the data about this, the projects, and what is there in the pipeline. Thank you. At the Southwest, I would like to praise the document. It followed a scientific methodology, and the team has gone through the experiences of the other countries, and this is great. So we in the Federation of Industries have seen former and previous documents, and this one is fully developed. The role of the state would be a regulator, and this is a very important issue. A regulator in tourism, health, education, as we have now some regulatory roles in telecommunication and transport, and this role would expand further for the public projects and the private projects. There are different methodologies to be followed, and the role of the regulator would increase. And if I want to give the private sector 65% or more, as you said, so now we need to create the working environment for the private sector. There are some obstacles we need to work on and give the opportunity to the private sector, and we need to work on creating the suitable working environment so that the private sector would give us the result we want. Thank you. Dr. Samih. Thank you, Mr. Prime Minister. And thank you for this initiative and this document. And I think that would be a structural turning point in the path of Egyptian economy if it is well implemented. I do not want to be lengthy because there are a lot of comments. I would like to say that the title of the document is indirect. I'm not criticizing, but I'm trying to share with you any information I have. It is the document of the state ownership policy, and you repeated 2 times that you are enhancing the role of the private sector. So here we're talking about the state ownership document, and in the background of the document we're talking talking about the state-owned assets and that we want to sell a value of 40 billion US dollars. I think that our main objective is encouraging the private sector. And I wish that this very good document would be under the title, The Role of the State and the Private Sector in Building New Egypt. By doing so, we are consistent, because sometimes we say New Egypt, sometimes we say encouraging the private sector, and other times we say the state ownership document. And for the first time, we have such a document. And this is an achievement on part of the government. So I think that this would be reflected in the way we are going to draft the document. The other point, if we agree that our objective is encouraging the private sector and not the state ownership or the state assets, then thank God that I'm not the private sector. But if I am the private sector, what would make me sure of this document that a lot of experts work on would be sustainable if the government changes? And what secures that it has credibility? So we need to translate this policy and this document into a legislation endorsed by the parliament or a constitutional amendment. The investment is a long-term decision built on expectations for the future and confidence. So when I say something in the Constitution that the private sector is a partner to development, construction of New Egypt, this would increase the rating. I think that this is an important point, because I looked in the Constitution and I found that in the second chapter there is only Article 36 that talks about encouraging the private sector. So if we are doing a turning point, we need to be aggressive and announce that the private sector is my partner to developing and building New Egypt. The third point, what if I decide to exit on list 1 and the private sector is not attracted to it? What if on the third list, which says increase, there is a history. I am saying increase and stabilizing. Till when? Also, the timing of the first and second, the second and the third lists is unclear. So it's a very good beginning, yet the message should be 100% clear. This is an excellent document, but the idea of neutral competitiveness is an excellent idea, yet we need to add to it the investing environment, because it is not just a matter of competitiveness, but there is another point, that it is cumbersome. There are a lot of obstacles. We all know that it is not just investment that does not come to Egypt, or Egyptians do not invest, but sometimes investments leave Egypt. The last point, to give the opportunity to others. The idea is not what I'm doing, but it's when I will exit in 3 years. Bangladesh and Vietnam, Qatar, Emirates, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, what are they going to go these 3 years? They might have a revolution. So I am in a race with time, in a race with others and the world technological changes. So I think that this should be taken into consideration. This dialogue today is very important, but we need to send quick messages. Maybe we cannot do all the reforms at the same time, but if we will have an official document, this would be excellent. Thank you. Let me make quick comments in clear messages. The main goal, and I would like to thank you all for your interventions, we are clarifying that the whole world, even Western companies that apply capitalism, has state presence in the economy. At a good percentage. In Europe, for example, it reaches 30% of the economy the state is present in. The other important thing is the role played by the state as a regulator to secure the balance, competitiveness, and equality in the economy, so that the opportunities would be there for everyone. That's why the last slide said, what do you see from your viewpoint to secure the sustainability? We cannot have a rigid document. It should be a vivid one, as you said. In some sectors, maybe after 2 or 3 years, we'll find that things are totally different. So we might need to review it. So it is a vivid document that can be amended. But the private sector might say that this means that I might be involved with you according to this document, and next year you will change it? No, we will have fixed rules. For some things, we know that this is not the role of the state, so it should be the private sector that should lead strongly. For the things that the state will be present in, how can we secure more partnerships with the private sector? How can we secure a bigger role for the private sector? One of the mechanisms, we are ruled by a lot of red tape and routine work. That's why establishing the sovereign fund and its law was that apart from all the routine work, we established this sovereign fund, and this is the experience of establishing them. Sometimes the countries establish these sovereign funds and move to it all the assets it believes to have problems and it cannot manage correctly, so that it would be restructured, moved to the fund. And the fund, with the law and flexibility, would be cooperating with the private sector and sign agreements to enable it to accelerate all the plans. That's why, once more, from my viewpoint, and this is a very important point, what are the messages and the executive steps you see on the short term? I have put 2 months to finalize this. So what are the things once we finish we should announce? Be it legislations we take to the members of the parliament, or for decisions to be issued, be it by the president or the cabinet. Dr. Ahmed. Thank you, Mr. Prime Minister. The main objective of the government is also keeping the indicators of macroeconomics like the budget deficit, unemployment rates, inflation. I think that the faster mechanism was before exiting certain sectors to keep our eyes on the economic indicators. I want to increase the growth rate, the employment rate, and so on. So the objective is keeping what we achieved now after the economic reform program in 2016, as well as taking into consideration anything that might happen in the future due to the developments. This would clarify to us the vision that which sectors we will exit to keep at least what we achieve. Yes, thank you. And here I would like to emphasize that even in the sectors that the state will be in, the President announced several times, and even today while we were inaugurating one of the big projects, the private sector presented what is doing with the state. Even for the sectors that we can be in, we want to have partnerships with the private sector. And this is a reality. The private sector is better in management and operation, of course. I, as a state, might be capable of establishing and pumping investments in certain fields, but if we come to talk about operation and management, of course the private sector is better, and the experience all over the world says so, and not Egypt only. So we are keen, even in the sectors where the President would continue, that there would be partnership with the private sector. Thank you, Mr. Prime Minister. Quick messages. This document is a translation of what the government has been asking for a while ago. We have two important points. Dr. Ziad mentioned one of them, and it is the appetite of the private sector and the world economic trends. So for this 3 years, we need to take this into consideration, and might exit a certain sector over 5 years. The other important point, when you asked what is the mechanism to implement this, I've done a legislative amendment and a procedural amendment, and I have with me the control authority in the field of electricity. So now I have been banned, the biggest solar farm worldwide. And the same applies to telecommunications. When we had the National Telecommunication Regulatory Authority, we have now all services. So the first phase that would reassure the investor, be it local or international, is that the state is not just exiting as an operator, but it established the regulatory bodies on the level of every sector. This is so important in the sectors I would like to exit. I need to create quickly these entities that would regulate them and secure that between the private sector and the government it is known who would do what. So that in electricity and telecommunications we will have investments in infrastructure and production. The last point, we need to have a clear definition of the term the state and definition of what is strategic, so that I, as a local or a foreign investor, would know how can I reply to any questions. Once more, this is what we are asking from you, that all the things you believe to need further clarification, then we will do it. So you need to listen to your proposals in this context. I talked about the 3 years, and I said that a debate happened about it, and some people said that we cannot exit certain sectors in 3 years, they might need 5 to 7 years. You know better whether this sector can be exited in 3 years or it needs more. This is what we need from you. Thank you very much. I want to say one important point. We're talking now. We are talking about the partially exit of the state. And this is one of the obstacles, and thank God that this document would be further discussed in the future. I still have the demand side, and we will need the Arab investors in particular and a lot of sovereign funds, because the coming period would be complicated. So I want the government to start looking at the obstacles of investments. There are investors that are already in Egypt and have problems, and some of them left Egypt. There is the taxes, overtaxing, litigation problems, multiple control entities. There are 7 or 8 obstacles. I am so glad with what you agreed upon regarding the land allocation, and we started discussing it instead of selling lands. But yet there are still obstacles, and we need to solve this problem in parallel to the supply. Thank you. First, we thank you for the invitation to attend the meeting today, and we would like to thank you for this valuable document and for focusing on the private sector and its role. You asked for specific things. First, the messages the government can make to reassure the private sector. I contacted my shareholders. They are all foreigners and sovereign funds. The first thing they mentioned is financial stability, the currency rate and the inflation rate. These are 2 important things to attract the foreign investors. The positive thing is that they said that Egypt's image abroad now is attractive. The next point is the government or the state when the investor comes to purchase an asset, the vision of this street toward the investor should be positive, because the street is always viewing the private sector to be a group of thieves who are here to steal the state assets. So how can we change this image? Through transparent mechanisms. We do not want to discuss again who would evaluate. Would it be the private sector or others? The mechanism of the work of everyone is clear. We will tell him this place is going to be sold, so we will go bring the 4 big investors, and they are well known. We will bring them and they will evaluate them, and then the central authority for accounting would say no. So which opinion are we going to take?
يقول اللي حصل دي احنا تعرضنا ليها لما كنا وزراء فيعني مش عايزين ده يحصل تاني.
So we do not want this problem to happen again after the great effort exerted in it. We do not want any conflict between private sector. So the reassurance message would be that we will go to the 4 main evaluators. And when I want to do due diligence, I'm going to go to them. The next point is, what are the needs of the private sector? The colleagues said them, so we won't discuss them again. My colleague, Dr. Mohamed Maït, worked with me in 2008. The taxes is a problem, the customs as well.
الناس عارفه قطعه الغيار. انا مثلا عندي جهاز مثلا فوق ثمنه 2 مليون دولار.
I have, for example, the issue of spare parts, and for spare parts to get into Egypt, it takes 45 days.
في لجنه اسمها لجنه السياسات.
There is a committee called the Policy Committee in the Ministry of Health. So I do not want to get into these small things. And of course the taxation system is improving now, and for customs they are improving things right now. These are all the messages that we can send to people. The valuation. The other point is health. It does not have a clear role here in this document. While whatever the richness of the state, it won't be able to meet the development needs for health services over the coming 20 years. The private sector needs to play a role here. How we are going to do it? The PPP law was issued in 2009, and I don't know whether there is an executive regulatory or not. We as a government did not succeed in applying this for a reason. Any PPP project, the government should secure the revenues for the first 3 or 4 projects, so that people would see that things are going fine. But to bring someone to be a partner to the government and then faces bureaucracy, this is a big problem. The last point, the experience in management. I have been through it outside Egypt. In one country in East Europe, this experience was a joint management for a health facility between the government and the private sector. The private sector gave higher salaries to the employees in this institution, while the rest of the employees had lower salaries, so this caused a lot of problem in operation. So the contracts themselves should be reconsidered from a legal perspective.
يقدر يبقى فيه قبول ومفيش مشاكل بين المستثمر وبين الدولة. شكرا.
Thank you.
شكرا معالي الرئيس.
Thank you, Mr. Prime Minister. The document reminds me of the October paper that was issued in the mid-70s and has put a new path for the state at that time. So this document is the same as that document, the October paper. And here comes its importance and the importance of dealing seriously with it. So this is the main objective. Dr. Samiha referred to the issue of the Constitution. And when we launch this document, it might include the part not referred to, and it would be like the new social contract. This is so important in light of the international developments you refer to. But we need a group of important things for this document to be a success. But if the objective is to increase the investment rates of the private sector by 65%, that is now only 21%, so this is a very ambitious objective, and this would meet a very difficult reality. We were supposed first to focus on studying why the experience of privatization failed before and what gave this bad impression in the Egyptian street about privatization. So even the document did not use this term and used other terms. as we can see regarding how people view private sector is so important in the community values, and here is a very important role, not only for decision makers, but an important role to be played by the media and the investor in every TV series is a certain stereotype that we all know. So there are main messages for this document, since we're talking about a new social contract different from the previous one of the 70s. And as Dr. Samiha said, this would be related to essential changes in the Egyptian constitution. I fear that people might understand from this document the proverb that the merchant, when he goes bankrupt, he starts looking for debts in his previous records, as if the state is trying to sell its assets to pay debts. And you said that we are going to liquidate the assets and overcome budget deficit. I think that this should not be discussed, because scientifically speaking, we cannot liquidate an asset of current expenditure. You need to create a competitive environment, as the document said. This competitive environment is so important, as well as amending the competitiveness and the non-monopoly law. The amendments are still in the parliament and not endorsed yet. This is a very important thing. So I mean to say that the general context for encouraging the role of the private sector should be the basis. But the idea of looking for liquidating assets to pay debts would raise worries among the private sector and also the public opinion. So, the other important part is sustainability, how to put specific conditions to secure that this document won't be linked to a specific government with due respect, but it would be the new October paper, a working paper for the state and not for the Egyptian government on the long term, and how can we secure for it mechanisms so that any government would implement this document. The last issue, how can we secure flexibility and sustainability? As you mentioned, there is an important part that there are international changes on the international arena. We do not know what are the international changes and how the international economy and the Egyptian economy would change. These are all things related to the fact that we need to have flexibility. And flexibility is very important. In the document, I think that this document would need detailed discussions, but one of the things that was mentioned was liquidating the assets. And I'm against having this in the document. The other thing is dissolving the activities. Dissolving is not a term to be used, it should be restructuring. Dr. Abdel Fattah, I'm so glad that you said so. And let me be honest. We have put a lot of mechanisms for exiting. And I said that this term does not mean that I am privatizing or selling. On the contrary, I might keep all assets and give full management to the private sector. This is in the international literature. The state can keep ownership of the assets. There are certain things that needs restructuring or reach that something is a loss
او في اي قطاع خاص ان شركه بتبقى خسرانه بالكامل، بنضطر في الاخر يعني بيعين خبير
So you need to have an expert to dissolve and this company. But this does not mean that everything would go in this direction.
حضرتك قلت نقطه مهمه جدا.
You said a very important point.
اللي اتقالت على موضوع الخصخصه او برامج
What was said about the privatization programs before 2010, and it gives the public opinion now in Egypt that the impression that this is negative. Your role as experts and your role is bigger than the government. To speak in talk shows and on the social media to clarify this to people, that when the state is having a partnership with the private sector, this does not mean that we're selling, or when we will exit an activity, the state is not leaving its role in performing these services or providing these products and commodities. On the contrary, you say that we want to change the stereotype. This is your role, to say that if we had a bad previous experience, how we can in the future have something more positive. And this is exactly what we should do through experts, because if the government would say it, people won't believe it. They will say, yes, maybe the government has the intentions to sell assets, and this is just a justification. But it's on the contrary. The government and the public sector are not the best to manage and operate and keep the assets on the medium and the longer term. It might have an excellent project as a state and started at certain phase for 2 or 3 years, but with the rhythm and the rules and the bureaucracy and the red tape, this asset in 10 years might not be as efficient as it was before. And give the same asset to the private sector and see how it would look like in 10 years. This is exactly what we are saying. The operation and the management is the experience of the private sector. And for the state to protect its assets, it should give it to the private sector to operate and manage it. Once more, changing the awareness and giving correct messages to the citizen would be your responsibility to explain this to people and to tell them, so that you would help the state while moving in this direction, to be convinced and accept that there are a lot of mechanisms and alternatives, and any state might use them to maximize their assets and achieve their objective, which is the satisfaction of the citizen and receiving the best services. Thank you, Mr. Prime Minister. In fact, for this dialogue to go on, we need to recognize the purpose of this document. The document means a set that the state is selling or liquidating. This is not the idea. The idea is a new version of the document that I read before, that talked about Article 27 of the Constitution, that gave a role to the private sector in light of the market mechanisms. And this is the new entry point. And in your speech today, you said that the events and the developments since 2011 up till today prevented the private sector from working in certain activities. So the state, to create job opportunities, made investments in productive activities or infrastructure. The idea is that we want to identify our objective.
من هذا الكلام اللي قالته الدكتورة سميحة.
And this covers part of what Dr. Samiha said, improving the investment opportunity to improve the standard of living of the citizen. And to do this, I need to create job opportunities, and creating job opportunities need investments. And the investments need that I would be a country that attracts investments. This is the concept. We need to hold the dialogue. I would like also to emphasize, in light of equal competition, the private sector does not want to compete with the state, with one condition, that the state would work professionally in light of fair competition. But the whole idea is that we need to create the things that we will start studying. The objective is not the document. The objective is, as the Prime Minister said, is creating opportunities. We do not have the luxury of time. Changes are very fast. And I fully know that in Europe and the US, countries are localizing now their industries and taking them back from Asia, though without getting into details. So we need a lot of things in the coming phase so as to attract investments, not for the purpose of investment, but for the purpose of improving the standard of living of the citizen. This is the concept that we need all to have. And we hope that we will start quickly working on that. Thank you.
أنا بشكر سيادتك على الدعوة الكريمة.
Thank you for the invitation.
وبحيي الجهاز اللي قام بهذه الوثيقة.
I would like to thank the team that worked on this
الفترة دي اللي احنا فيها.
We really need
نتيجة لأن الفترة اللي فاتت كانت
جزء من الشغل في مصر
يعني بتقوم به الدولة. وبالتالي
witnessed a lot of projects implemented by the state, so any investor in the world fears coming to Egypt. They say that every day you have new laws and regulations. So when you are stable, we will come. Or investors say so. I'm not talking about generalities. I'm going to talk about one specific thing. We're talking about development, and we're talking about an added value, about agriculture, industry, service sectors. I will talk about industry. This sector is importing 60% of its raw materials. I'm an old country that has minerals.
ولكن بقالنا مدة بنتخبط في
But
دور التعدين في مصر.
we do not have a system for mining in Egypt. So mining is in the gray area.
التعدين في العالم زي البترول.
Mining all over the world is like petroleum. Petroleum is done by very big investments, international companies that have the technology. In Egypt, I can be a big mining company, yet the general environment does not allow an investor in this field to come to work. We're talking here about the different minerals, especially industrial minerals that we get from quarries. When we come to talk about mining, we have the upstream part, and the upstream here is more than petroleum, and the other is the downstream activity, the manufacturing. Having mining is a risk, so people fear that, and we have a lot of arbitration in Egypt that we lost, unfortunately. So this is one important point. The regulatory bodies in Egypt should not be under ministries.
يبقى حكم
So the regulatory body
وزميله
cannot
الأجهزة
be
تبقى
a
هي بتلعب
judge
في الملعب. ما
and
ينفعش
a player.
whatever it is. واحنا عندنا 3 أجهزة
We have 3 regulatory bodies in Egypt on electricity, gas, and telecommunications. And the ministries should do the regulatory bodies. The ministries cannot own companies that compete with the private sector. We have a big opportunity. The world now is changing. I need the foreign investor in mining. As since the year 1958, we succeeded in having a petroleum industry that have credibility over the world. In mining, unfortunately, we attend the conferences and they say, what does Egypt have? We have 32 different minerals with quality and reserves. Thank you.
شكرا يا فندم. واسمحوا لي هنا برضو مرة أخرى
Let
عايز
me here
برضو
once
أعمل شوية
more
تعقيبات.
make some comments.
القطاع الخاص في مصر
The private sector in Egypt, and this is an important point, even with the increase of investments, especially the public investments made by the state. The state was pumping investment, and it was the private sector implementing. 99% of all public investments were implemented.
الدولة ما عندهاش كيانات قادرة يعني كشركات انها هي اللي كانت تنزل تنفذ. فاحنا كده لما عملنا
So we did not have companies to implement. So by doing so,
مجال قطاع التعدين انا متفق مع حضرتك ويمكن احنا غيرنا يعني الآلية
we changed the mechanism
بالذات للتعدين لان كان يعني ليه طريقة معينة بحيث ان احنا نفتح
we tried to open the floor for investors in mining, and we are opening excavation places like those for the gas and petroleum. So we'll be so keen on increasing the role of this sector, and we'll be so glad to listen to your viewpoint. How can we benefit more from this important sector in the coming phase?
لو في يعني لو بعد اذنكم عشان يعني طبعا انا يعني عشان وقت حضراتكم لو في مداخلتين يعني
we can only take 2 other interventions for the matter of time.
الموضوع اتفضل يا استاذ.
شكرا معالي رئيس الوزراء.
Thank you, Mr. Prime Minister, for the invitation and for the document. In brief, I suggest that when the document is semi-final, it should be drafted in English so that we do not leave it for the foreign platforms to translate it themselves, and we clarify certain points. The other important point is that there are some sectors in the document that says that the state either would stabilize its ownership or increase its investments. We need to see how the state would increase its investments. And regarding insurance sector, the country would increase its investments, and now 90% of the insurance is for the state. So we say that the state would increase its investments in this sector. I'm talking about this field in particular. So we want this to be clarified. How would the state share increase here? Thank you. One last intervention. Thank you, Mr. Prime Minister, for the invitation and the document. It was our request, so thank you for your response. One quick point, I totally agree with my colleague, Dr. Ziad, that we need to clarify what is the definition of a state. And we need to identify the projects owned by sovereign entities. Is it part of the concept of the state? Yes, I'm emphasizing it. This includes all state institutions.
احنا بنتكلم كل
We are
مؤسسات
talking
الدولة.
about all state
هي
institutions.
الوثيقة دي بتشمل كل
This
مؤسسات
document covers all state institutions. Okay, thank you.
في بعض يعني التخارج خلال 3 سنين
And exit over 3 years.
الوثيقة أشارت إلى
The
ضعف الاستثمار الأجنبي.
document referred to weak foreign investments.
والاستثمار المصري واضح بدليل إن إحنا
And the Egyptian investment, and in the document we are asking for increasing the private sector by 65% over a number of years. So I will wait for 3 years for the investment to start. No, this is not what we mean. We mean that I might start tomorrow. The table and the sectors should be clarified. In the document, there is reference to investment, but very small ones. So we need to focus on it.